Hey y'all, it's me Sydney. Welcome back to Planet Syd. So today we are going to be discussing the 2008 screenplay Doubt. If you guys haven't seen it, I suggest that you pause this video, watch it, and then watch it again, and then watch it again, and then come back. So today we are going to be discussing the 5-time Oscar-nominated film Doubt, which is based on the stage play Doubt, a Parable. So it is also a Pulitzer Prize and Tony Award-winning stage play as well. And basically, this takes place in 1964 at a Catholic elementary school in the Bronx, New York. And Donald Miller is the first Black student there. And one of the nuns, who was played by Meryl Streep, her name is Sister Aloysius. She suspects that there is an inappropriate relationship between the priest, Father Flynn, who was played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, and the boy Donald Miller. Before we dive into it, I do just want to get into some definitions and important keywords that we hear a lot throughout the film. So Google would define doubt as, quote, a feeling of uncertainty or a lack of conviction. This is really important because obviously the stage play and the screenplay as well is named after doubt. So this comes up a lot. And so the next definition is certain. And Google would define certain as to know for sure or to establish beyond doubt. And the last definition we're going to explore is truth. And Google will define that as which is true or in accordance with fact or reality, or a fact or belief that is accepted as true. Now, these three words are very important. They obviously come up many times throughout the film and the stage play in reference to whether or not Father Flynn did have an inappropriate relationship with Donald Miller and possibly other students at the Catholic school. So now that we got that out of the way, let's do a quick little rundown of the plot. So the movie starts just by getting like a little feel of the neighborhood, and we see one of the altar boys getting ready to go to church on Sunday and just like walking through the neighborhood. And so the first actual scene that we get is Father Flynn giving his sermon, who was played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, R.I.P. to him. But yeah, he's giving his sermon, and the topic of his sermon is doubt. And the one thing that he says that stuck with me in this sermon was, quote, doubt can be a bond as powerful and sustaining as certainty. We get to see more of an interaction between just how the school runs. And so this makes Sister Aloysius suspicious. She is the head nun and the principal at the school. And this is who Meryl Streep plays. And so we know this because after the sermon, we get to the dinner scene with all of the nuns. And she basically tells them to keep their eyes and ears out because she suspects that Father Flynn may be doubtful of something. She doesn't know what though. And so she's wondering what he is doubtful about. And so over the next few scenes, we get to see what life is like at St. Michael's Catholic School. And we also get to see Father Flynn have limited interactions with different boys at the school, along with Donald Miller as well. So fast forward, we get to a music class, which Sister James is teaching. And Sister James is played by Amy Adams. In this movie, she is younger and she seems more naive and innocent. But she's just teaching the music class. It's a normal day, and she sees Father Flynn walk, and he puts something in Donald Miller's locker, and then he walks away. And then so she goes to see what it is because she's keeping in mind that Sister Aloysius told her to keep her eyes and ears out. So she looks in the locker and she sees that it's his undershirt. So this is when she becomes doubtful and just like suspicious. And so Sister James tells Sister Aloysius what she saw and that she noticed that Father Flynn is pretty protective of Donald Miller. Previously, when Father Flynn had called Donald Miller down to the rectory during her class, when he came back, he wasn't acting normal. And she said that she was certain that she smelled alcohol on his breath. And so this news that Sister James is telling Sister Aloysius, it kind of confirms her suspicions of Father Flynn. And so from this point on, throughout the rest of the film, Sister Aloysius is making it her mission to get Father Flynn out of the parish. And then so this eventually leads to a confrontation between Sister Aloysius, Sister James, and Father Flynn. And basically they just tell him the things that they've been seeing, and they don't outright accuse him, but they allude that there is something weird about his relationship. So they're giving him the opportunity to explain himself. And basically after a little back and forth, he says that he caught Donald Miller drinking altar wine, and he didn't want to tell anyone because then he would have to kick him off of the altar boys. And he knows that Donald Miller is already having a hard time blending in and is getting teased as well at school because he is the first Black student there. And so he didn't want to make his life already harder because he did enjoy being an altar boy. And then so when asked about the shirt in the locker, he says that he didn't want to give Donald his shirt back in front of everyone because he didn't want him to be embarrassed. And so Sister James, which is played by Amy Adams, she takes and accepts his explanation, but Sister Aloysius just does not buy it. And he says that there is someone who corroborates his story and that he isn't pleased with Sister Aloysius' behavior and that his next sermon will be about intolerance. So obviously he has some shade towards Sister Aloysius, and we'll get more into that. But fast forward to the following Sunday, Father Flynn gives his sermon, and he basically is saying that gossip is a sin. He goes on to give an example of a parable about a woman who gossiped and played with a man's reputation. And so he then compares gossiping to going up on a roof on a windy day and slitting a pillow open and feathers going everywhere. And when you gossip and potentially ruin someone's reputation, it's basically irreversible. Like, you literally can't pick every feather out of the air. So I thought that was an interesting analogy. So after this, we see Father Flynn run into Sister James in the courtyard, and she again asks him, is it true? Because she is still pretty unsettled about her own suspicions. Father Flynn again denies it, and he goes on to explain that he just sees the good in people, just like how Sister James does, and that he knew that Donald Miller needed somebody to lean on and everything. So basically, like, they are both just genuinely kind-hearted people. And by the end of this conversation, Sister James does actually say that she believes that he is innocent. And so that's that. Fast forward a bit, we finally get to meet Mrs. Miller, who is played by Viola Davis. And this is where we get that infamous scene, which is like a masterclass in acting. This is what got Viola Davis. It really put her on the map as far as like film, because she was doing like a lot of Broadway work before this, but this specific scene really put her on the map, and it got her her first Oscar nomination. So anyways, back to the plot. So Sister Aloysius called a meeting with Mrs. Miller, who was played by Viola Davis, and throughout this conversation, Mrs. Miller, she expresses her gratitude for Father Flynn for being someone that Donald can confide in. And Sister Aloysius then expresses to Mrs. Miller that she suspects that Father Flynn may have made improper advances on her son. And we'll dive deeper into this specific scene later on. But long story short, Mrs. Miller alludes that her son is gay and his father is very abusive towards them. And so she then goes on to paint a picture of her life in the different directions that she's being pulled to try and give her son the best life that she possibly can. And so by the end of this conversation, Mrs. Miller basically ends up saying that her son needs somebody to be good to him, even if that is Father Flynn, whether or not their doubts and suspicions are in fact true or not. So after this, in Sister Aloysius' shoes, she feels that she is the only one who is genuinely concerned with their relationship. And so eventually, Sister Aloysius and Father Flynn have one big blowout in a confrontation that basically ends in him agreeing to go to another parish. Now, this is a very condensed version of events in the film, and we'll have to dive in deeper later. But now I want to get into the characters. Sister Aloysius is the principal and the head nun of St. Michael's Catholic School, and you can see throughout the first few minutes of the film how her presence is widely feared due to her no-nonsense attitude and how much she values tradition when it comes to teaching. You see this in small little ways, like when she refuses to let her students use a ballpoint pen. And even though Sister Aloysius has a very tough exterior, you can see throughout many times in the film as well that she does genuinely care about the students at the school as well as her fellow nuns. And mind you, this film took place in 1964, and Sister Aloysius is an older white woman. Scholars estimate that she was probably born in the early 1900s, and women barely had rights. And so I'm sure that Sister Aloysius' choice to be a nun, coupled with the time period, greatly reinforced her traditionalist attitude. And it's interesting watching Sister Aloysius struggle with her being a well-respected presence in the school, but still essentially being powerless because she is a woman. And again, this is a Catholic church. And so she is like pretty much powerless when it comes to calling out seemingly inappropriate behavior within the church involving powerful men. And even though this film is about her suspecting that Father Flynn isn't as good of a person as he presents to be, and his questionable relationship with a younger boy in the school, the audience gets a clear picture that Sister Aloysius is right about her feeling like she can't trust the men and the chain of command in the Catholic Church, more specifically in her parish. And you see this very clearly during the dinner scene. It's pretty early on in the movie, But we see the nuns all eating their dinner, and they're all eating very balanced meals, like some kind of roast, some mixed vegetables, some peas, and then they're all drinking milk, and they're basically all eating in complete silence. Sister Aloysius is at the head of the table, and it cuts to a scene with the men eating. It's Father Flynn, the Monsignor, and a pastor as well. It doesn't look as pristine as far as just like their setup. They're all smoking cigarettes and drinking scotch or something. And also the conversation as well. Like, they're talking about women and like they're calling them fat. And they're just talking about women in a really degrading way. And this is supposed to be the priest, the pastor, and the Monsignor of the church. But even though each party is doing this in the company of their own gender, it isn't a stretch to assume that Sister Aloysius isn't aware that these men aren't as morally upright as they portray themselves to be. They also protect each other as well, just like the system of the Catholic Church. And they, in a way, don't respect her just because she is a woman. And this is demonstrated many times throughout the film, like when she confronts Father Flynn again, and she tells him that she talked to someone at his old parish, and when he asks who, she says it was a nun, and that's when he gets angry, and he basically scolds her and tells her that he isn't pleased with her behavior. He reminded her that she took a vow, and one of them being obedience. And so everybody's aware of this weird power dynamic, and so when things do get a little sticky, they reinforce it. In another instance could be when Father Flynn and Sister Aloysius had their first confrontation. Before they even get into the conversation and he's aware that they even have these doubts and suspicions, he enters her office and he immediately sits in her chair at her desk, and he doesn't think twice about it. So Sister Aloysius and Sister James have to sit on the other side of the desk as if they were visitors and he's not in her office. And we see in this very small take that Sister Aloysius, when he positions himself at her desk, she's taken aback, but she does eventually just go sit down and she doesn't say anything. So regardless of what our opinion is on the nature of the relationship between Father Flynn and Donald Miller, we can clearly see that there is a culture that enables and protects men within the church. And furthermore, it is implied that there was another priest before Father Flynn who was quote unquote inappropriate. But Sister Aloysius had Father Scully, who was somebody that she could trust. Sister Aloysius feels that she really can't trust any of the men there, so she makes it her personal mission to get Father Flynn out. And we see that Sister Aloysius, in a way, does have good reason to be distrustful of the men at St. Michael's Catholic School, because by the end of the movie, when Father Flynn does choose to go to another parish, it is revealed that he was promoted to a pastor, which is surprising, but at the same time, not really, because we all know how the Catholic Church is. I do want to reiterate that it was never confirmed whether or not Father Flynn and Donald Miller had an inappropriate relationship or not. And so it was never confirmed if Father Flynn was actually guilty, but there was no due diligence on the church's end. And the audience can clearly see this as well when Sister Aloysius says that she spoke with the Monsignor and he basically blew her off, or how comfortable Father Flynn was offering for her to speak with the pastor from his previous parish, but how enraged he got whenever she said that she spoke with a nun and not a pastor. And I find it very interesting how in the film Father Flynn was pushing for more change and progressiveness, all the while still overlooking women who were supposed to have some power. Like, you can't have both. And I also feel that Sister Aloysius, being such a traditionalist, is what fuels her disdain for Father Flynn as well. Because before her suspicions, it was apparent that she didn't seem to be very fond of Father Flynn and his progressive attitude. And this makes sense because this was set in 1964, which was when the Catholic Church was going through a lot of changes as well to adjust to more modern times. And this is the first time in the history of the Catholic Church that they had made systemic changes as far as trying to be more progressive and modern. So maybe she felt like she had to preserve tradition because a lot of these traditions had governed her life for so long, and it would be odd for her to do anything else. And we also see Sister Aloysius' reluctance to change many times as well. Like when she says that the wind doesn't blow the same as it once did after like a really bad storm, or her reluctance to include a secular song in the Christmas play. And you can also see this in the cinematography as well, like with the multiple angles and the corner shots, where it kind of looks like the world is just not quite right. So it's a new day, but Sister Aloysius is still stuck in the medieval times. And I also think it's interesting how Sister James' doubts are what fuels Sister Aloysius' certainty, even though there really is no proof. But we also see a few times throughout the film that Sister Aloysius has her hunches, but she always seems to be right. And she makes it pretty clear early on that her job is to be the eyes and the ears of St. Michael's Catholic School and to always be 10 steps ahead. And in a way that makes sense, because outside of like her just being a nun, she is also a principal and was a teacher before, so you kind of have to be ahead of it so you kind of won't get run over by your students. That didn't really stand out to me as weird. There have been instances demonstrated throughout the film that she had good reason to be suspicious or doubtful of any situation. And so we see that when Sister James tells Sister Aloysius that she notices how Father Flynn seems to be suspiciously close to Donald Miller, Sister Aloysius in a way scolds herself for not even considering that as a possibility. She suspected that Donald Miller would have some trouble assimilating as far as like bullying and teasing with the other students, but she never suspected that that could even be an option. She has good reason to suspect that because he would be the most vulnerable person, considering the fact that he is the first Black student. And so she suspected fighting and bullying, but she never even suspected a potentially inappropriate relationship. And from my perspective, Sister Aloysius, she does seem to care about the well-being of the students there, and as a head nun and the principal, it would make sense that she feels the need to consider every possibility. And again, considering the fact that this is a Catholic church, she isn't out of line for having her doubts about Father Flynn, and you can see this in the contrast in how Sister Aloysius deals with the revelation compared to Sister James. Sister Aloysius feels that she should have known better, and Sister James can't even fathom the thought. We'll revisit that later as far as Sister James, but this is demonstrated a few more times as well. Like when Sister James sends William London home for a bloody nose, and William London is another student at the school, and he seems to be like the more mischievous, like gets into trouble a lot. But she sent him home because he had a bloody nose. But Sister Aloysius said that he probably caused it himself just so he can get out of school. The camera cuts to him and we see that Sister Aloysius was right and he seems just fine. You can also see this when she begins to wonder why Father Flynn may be in doubt after hearing his sermon. And so the audience gets a clear picture that Sister Aloysius is very in tune with everything that is happening at her school, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does kind of give a window into maybe she does know what she's talking about, but then again, maybe she just doesn't like Father Flynn. So yeah, that's a little rundown on Sister Aloysius as a character, but now I want to get into Sister James, who again is played by Amy Adams. Sister James is one of the younger nuns, and we immediately get the impression that she is soft-spoken, kind, and she kind of has this air of innocence. And we see that she is kind of a bit of a people pleaser when it comes to her superiors, but we see that she does care deeply about her students as well. And throughout the film, we get to see Sister James transform from this meek nun who let her students walk all over her to a person who is kind, but still demands respect. And Sister James has this childlike innocence about her, especially in comparison to Sister Aloysius. And I feel like her innocence in a way makes her easy to manipulate because she assumes that everyone has the same intentions as her. And when she feels that Father Flynn may be taking advantage of Donald Miller, it turns her world upside down. We see this possible revelation. It affects everyone differently throughout the film, but she seems particularly disturbed and wants to return back to how things were before. And I feel like her age really explains her innocence, because even though her age is never revealed and specified, she is obviously a grown woman, but she's presumably in her 20s and is a nun at a Catholic school. One would assume that a majority, if not all, of her formative years, she's been socialized to be a pure, God-fearing woman. In contrast to someone like Sister Aloysius, it was revealed halfway throughout the In contrast to somebody like Sister Aloysius, it was revealed that halfway throughout the film that she previously had a husband who died in war, I believe, and then she became a nun. So she has more experience with the real world outside of the church, and then obviously becoming a nun. So they both have very different perspectives of people and their imperfect world. And Sister James can't even fathom that a student would lie to her to get out of class, let alone that Father Flynn is potentially an abuser. So it makes sense why she was quick to believe Father Flynn's explanation for meeting with Donald Miller. and why she can no longer sleep well even after convincing herself that he is innocent. And I think that the ambiguity of the entire situation deeply affected Sister James in the end, because she never knew if he was guilty or not. So it kind of dimmed her light in a way and changed her sunny view of the world, because that situation showed her that you can't assume that everyone is morally sound, even the people who are supposed to be extensions of God. And also a line that stuck with me in this film was, quote, "In the pursuit of wrongdoing, one steps away from God." And I think that that philosophy alone shook Sister James to her core, because her world was so simple before this whole revelation. And she is starting to slowly realize throughout the film that in order to cultivate a safe environment, she most likely would have to take a step away from God, because this is an imperfect world and everyone isn't created equal. By the end of the film, Sister James confides in Sister Aloysius and says that she can no longer sleep. And Sister Aloysius says that maybe they are meant to sleep that well. And we're going to revisit that like towards the end. But this shows that this whole ordeal wasn't particularly easy for Sister Aloysius as well, but it illustrates the conflicting positions that women in the church find themselves in pretty often, and I can only imagine in the Catholic Church in 1964. So the next character that we have is Father Flynn. It was played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. R.I.P. He is an amazing actor. So Father Flynn seemed like the cool progressive elder, and you can see this in the many interactions that he has with the students. They feel comfortable telling him about their crushes or asking a girl out to the dance. And this may sound minor, but keep in mind that this is a Catholic school in 1964, where earlier in the movie, Sister Aloysius scolded a girl for wearing a barrette in her hair, and another for listening to the radio. So to most of the kids and to some of the staff as well, Father Flynn seems like a breath of fresh air. But there are some small instances where the camera captures very, very small interactions between some of the boys and Father Flynn, and it leaves it up to the audience to come to our own conclusions. And for example, one is where William London, who is the mischievous one, at the very beginning of the movie, Father Flynn grabbed his hand and looked at it to see if his fingernails were clean, and he immediately snatched his hand away. And again, throughout the film, we see him acting out and being mischievous throughout the film, but some may wonder, are you just a young boy who's acting out, or is there a reason for that? And also there are a few moments where Jimmy Hurley, who was the other altar boy, he always just seemed slightly uncomfortable in Father Flynn's presence. And also, Donald Miller did have a strange demeanor after he did visit Father Flynn in the rectory, which initially alarmed Sister James and confirmed Sister Aloysius' doubts. So it could be argued that these instances can be explained away by saying that we're reading into it too much, or Donald was actually sad because he did get caught drinking altar wine. So yeah, you never really know, but I do appreciate how the film leaves it to the audience to self-reflect and to draw their own conclusions. Because on one hand, these genuinely could be innocent interactions, but on another hand, Father Flynn could be using his progressive, cool reputation to take advantage of some of the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable student at St. Michael's Catholic School. It's so interesting because this is such a heavy topic, so nobody wants to jump to that conclusion and be wrong, because the fallout would be terrible. But you also have to read in between the lines as well, because child predators in the church specifically aren't out here in 4K doing whatever. So you'd either be ruining an innocent man's reputation or letting the abuse of a child continue. And it's kind of an impossible situation, and all you can really rely on is your doubts and hope that it will lead you to the truth. And another thing is that even though Sister Aloysius' beliefs may be outdated, we can clearly see that she wants the best for the students. So in Father Flynn's defense, Sister Aloysius could very well be convinced that he is a predator based solely on her doubts and not the absolute truth, because confirmation bias is real. And she was already convinced that there was something not right about Father Flynn. So maybe she's seeing things that aren't there. Like, that is a very real possibility. And we'll touch more on confirmation bias as well. But now I would like to focus on some of the pros and cons of Father Flynn. So some of the cons is that the boys, again, do seem uncomfortable around Father Flynn. But then William London did snatch his hand away from him, and also seemed uncomfortable around Father Flynn throughout the entirety of the film. Jimmy Hurley specifically does seem uncomfortable around him as well, but then there is no real evidence of him being a pedophile. But one thing that I will say about Father Flynn is that we can see that he kind of, in a way, instills religious fears and shame through his sermons. The thing that I found interesting about this film is that the sermons that Father Flynn gives tells a lot. When the film starts, of course, he is giving a sermon about doubt, which eventually raises Sister Aloysius' suspicions. And later on, he gives a sermon about intolerance and tells us the parable about gossip and reputations. And I think that this is so interesting because he did honestly make a valid point with the feather parable. So basically, when he compares gossiping to going up on a roof on a windy day and slitting a pillow open, the feathers do go everywhere and it's impossible to pick up every feather. And he compares that to being reckless with a person's reputation. He does have a point because it's basically impossible to repair a person's reputation after such serious accusations. Because again, from the audience's perspective, we have no idea what the truth is. And the only people who genuinely know what the truth is Father Flynn and Donald Miller. But at the same time, whether Father Flynn is guilty or not, we do get to see how he relies on his position within the church to abuse his power and to instill religious shame through his sermons. And I say this because when you are a pastor, especially as beloved as he was by the students and congregation, they start to see him as an extension of God. So maybe that made it easier for him to possibly abuse his power and potentially abuse children as well because they don't want to disappoint God, if that makes sense. He does confirm that his sermon was about someone in particular, and it makes me wonder if he gave that sermon in hopes of him saying that gossiping is a sin would get her to back off. And you can see this again in the moment where he reiterates that Sister Aloysius took a vow of obedience when he feels that she is out of line, or when he talks to Sister James in the courtyard and he says that people sees their light as weakness and to not let anyone change them. And you also see this when he speaks to Sister James. It changes her mind and she says that she does believe him. A part of me is like, are you genuinely a kind person or did you just manipulate this girl? And what I love about this film and play in particular is that for the most part, everyone's true intentions are ambiguous. Is Father Flynn a manipulative abuser, or is he an innocent person who just wants to feel more relatable? Does Sister Aloysius genuinely feel that the well-being of Donald Miller is in question, or does she just not like Father Flynn? Both are very real possibilities. So, I don't know. Another thing that's interesting is that by the end, when Father Flynn agrees to go to another parish, I couldn't even interpret it as an admission of guilt, because had he stayed, Sister Aloysius would have made it her mission to ruin his reputation and to turn the congregation against him. So I don't know. Every time I watch it, I'm just like, okay, he definitely did it. And then I watch it again and I'm just like, well, so that's Father Flynn. But now I want to finally get into that scene. If you're watching this video, then you know what scene I'm talking about. It's the confrontation between Mrs. Miller and Sister Aloysius, where Meryl Streep and Viola Davis both get their Oscar nominations, and this is when Viola Davis got her GOAT status. So now I want to explore Black motherhood, because when Sister Aloysius finally does meet with Mrs. Miller, we get a small window into what's going on in Mrs. Miller's head and her life. So in the first few moments, we do see that she is a hardworking woman who is doing her best to stay afloat, and also that her husband is most likely abusive to her and her son, Donald. And I say this because when we first meet Mrs. Miller, she makes it very clear that she only has a few minutes because she's there during her lunch break, and that Mr. Miller couldn't make it because he couldn't get off of work. Mrs. Miller says that Donald was sad about being taken off the altar boys, but it seemed like a fair punishment for drinking the wine, and eventually that his father beat the hell out of him for getting in trouble. And so Sister Aloysius then says that he shouldn't do that, and Mrs. Miller responds by saying that you don't tell him what to do, in reference to her husband. You see her kind of in a way like disassociate for a second. And so yeah, she only alludes to it, but it does give an audience a look into what her life is like and what life is like for Donald as well in the position that Mrs. Miller is in. And so during this conversation, Mrs. Miller, she then expresses how grateful she is for Father Flynn and that she is happy that her son has someone looking out for him. And soon after this, Sister Aloysius begins to walk with Mrs. Miller and says that there may be a problem. And so Mrs. Miller then responds by saying, quote, whatever it is, he just has to make it until June. Mrs. Miller repeats that phrase quite a few times throughout this conversation, and this shows that Mrs. Miller's main concern is for her child to get into a good high school and an opportunity to go to college. But then Sister Aloysius reveals that she is concerned that Father Flynn may have made advances on Donald Miller, her son, and that she thinks that Father Flynn gave Donald the altar wine. And so Mrs. Miller seems to be in denial, but then asks why her son got in trouble and taken off the altar boys if it was the priest who gave it to him. And Sister Aloysius then says it was because her son was caught and the priest wasn't. And so this is where things start to really heat up, and we see that Sister Aloysius and Mrs. Miller are clearly living in two different realities. Mrs. Miller is disappointed but not surprised that her son is basically taking the blame for a grown man's actions, and tells Sister Aloysius that she won't win trying to go up against the church. And Sister Aloysius is clearly taken aback by Mrs. Miller's reluctance and reiterates that she feels that Father Flynn may have been creating an improper relationship with her son. And so Mrs. Miller responds by saying that, quote, "Why do you have to know something like that when you don't?" And you see this recurring theme of this reluctance to know or find out the truth, because the only evidence that one has is Sister Aloysius' doubt. And furthermore, Mrs. Miller is so plagued by survival and the need to see her son have a chance at a better life that she really doesn't have the privilege to make decisions based solely off of the emotional well-being of him. And obviously she's a lower class Black woman in an abusive relationship in 1964. And Sister Aloysius goes on to say, quote, "What kind of mother are you?" Mrs. Miller responds by saying that she doesn't know enough about life to ask her such a thing. And this is really important because Sister Aloysius never really considered that due to race and class, their responses to this doubt would be very, very different. This shows that Mrs. Miller is in an impossible position. She's kind of being tugged between being a mother and being a Black woman in 1964, which is essentially powerless. And Sister Aloysius thought that she could bring Mrs. Miller on because they are both women and they should want the same thing. But Mrs. Miller's main concern is keeping her son out of harm's way to the best of her ability and getting him into a good school. And so it makes sense why she keeps on reiterating that Donald just has to make it until June, because there really aren't any better alternatives. And at this point, Sister Aloysius is still adamant, and Mrs. Miller in a way feels cornered and alludes that her son is gay as well. And she says that the kids at his previous school were going to kill him. And so after this, Mrs. Miller goes on to say that, quote, "His father don't like him. He comes to your school and kids don't like him. One man is good to him, this priest. And does the man have his reasons? Yes, everybody does. You have your reasons, but do I ask the man why he is good to my son? No, I don't care why. My son needs someone to care about him and to see him through to where he wants to go. And thank God this educated man with some kindness in him wants to do just that." End quote. And that's a lot to marinate on, but Mrs. Miller is in an impossible situation, and Sister Aloysius is still not satisfied with Mrs. Miller's transparency because she isn't able to view this situation from any other point of view. She then goes on to threaten to throw Donald Miller out of the school, which confuses Mrs. Miller because it didn't start with him, whatever it is. At this point, I started to give Sister Aloysius the side eye as well, because it didn't really seem like she genuinely cared about the possibility that Donald Miller's life could be the collateral damage in her pursuit of the truth. And this also shows how Sister Aloysius is in an impossible situation as well, though, because she can't depend on the church. So this must be the step away from God when addressing wrongdoing she was referring to previously. As we'll see later on when she said that she spoke to the nun to Father Flynn, we eventually find out that that was a lie. But anyway, Sister Aloysius and Mrs. Miller are going back and forth, and the conversation basically ends with Mrs. Miller begging Sister Aloysius to keep Donald out of this because her husband would kill Donald over a thing like this. And that is just until June, which Sister Aloysius replies, quote unquote, "I'll try." And this shows that the stakes are way higher for Donald Miller and that there is a lot more to lose. And Donald Miller would risk being sent back to his old school where he was tormented by the other kids. And he also risked possibly being killed by his father as well, for getting caught and losing the one male figure in his life that he feels loved by. So to Mrs. Miller, the best decision for her son is to stay where he is at St. Michael's, where he could possibly be being abused, because at least there's someone there who quote unquote cares about him. because again, there really aren't any better alternatives. And this specific interaction between Mrs. Miller, who was played by Viola Davis, and Sister Aloysius, who was played by Meryl Streep, it reminded me of that one scene in Little Fires Everywhere. If you haven't seen it, you should. Kerry Washington had to let Reese Witherspoon know that you did not make good choices. You had good choices. At the beginning of that scene, you know, when Sister Aloysius was like, "What kind of mother are you?" By the end of it, she kind of has to take a step back and realize that they do exist in different realms and different realities, and that Mrs. Miller is doing the best that she can for her son. And so there really isn't a right choice. And so we previously went over how Mrs. Miller alluded to her son Donald being gay. And I'm bringing this up because Father Flynn's nails were brought up quite a few times throughout the script, and more specifically his choice to keep his fingernails long, which was odd for a man, let alone a priest, in 1964. And I'm only pointing this out because I wonder if his fingernails were meant to represent some repression in regard to Father Flynn's sexuality. And I'm only saying this because the only people that seemed uncomfortable around Father Flynn were some of the boys. So I wonder if Sister Aloysius had some internalized homophobia, and maybe that informed some of her doubts, or if maybe that was actually hinting at something else. And this is important because she doesn't really seem bothered by Mrs. Miller's revelation that Donald may be gay, but I wouldn't be surprised if she reacted differently had a priest been struggling with their sexuality. And it kind of reminds me like how some older folks say like they don't mind gay people, like do whatever you want, but their reaction is very differently when their child is gay or something like that. I do find it a very real possibility because Sister Aloysius wasn't shy about how odd Father Flynn's long fingernails were, and she told him to cut his nails. But again, in Father Flynn's defense, Sister Aloysius didn't already seem to be very fond of him, and his eagerness for change as well. So when Sister James had her doubts, that was basically all she needed, and all the confirmation that she needed that Father Flynn was a terrible person. And that, possibly coupled with some internalized homophobia, it was no changing Sister Aloysius' mind. But then again, on the other hand, there are a lot of small instances how certain boys would react when Father Flynn was around. Jimmy Hurley, who was pretty mild-mannered throughout the film, he has an outburst in class after Father Flynn grabbed his shoulder, and seems to be uncomfortable throughout the film as well. And Donald Miller did seem pretty odd after going to the rectory. Furthermore, if Father Flynn is actually guilty, first and foremost, that would make him a predator, but that will also raise questions about his sexuality. And I do want to make it clear that those two things do not overlap. Any predator can be gay, straight, whatever. I just want to put that out there. But maybe that is what the fingernails represented, because there were multiple shots throughout the film of his fingernails up close, and then it was also in the script as well. But again, Father Flynn is not the victim, and like Sister Aloysius said, my compassion is nowhere that he can reach it. The only people who I genuinely have sympathy for and compassion for are the children and the students, and specifically Donald Miller and Mrs. Miller, because everyone's true motives were so ambiguous that I really did not know who to trust by the end of the film. The only people who genuinely seemed like they were just trying to do the best with what they had were Mrs. Miller, and I guess by extension Donald Miller. I guess in some degree, Sister James, but then again, her willful ignorance sometimes could be a problem. But that's just my opinion. Now I want to explore the difference between doubt, absolute truth, and certainty, because again, those words get brought up a lot throughout the film. Doubt is, quote, a feeling of uncertainty or a lack of conviction, end quote. And this is what starts the whole chain of events, because Father Flynn's unnamed doubts that inspired his sermon in the opening scene, and Sister James' doubt that Father Flynn could be making inappropriate advances on Donald Miller. And so that specific doubt is informed by Sister James' doubt turned certainty when she smelled alcohol on Donald's breath when he came back from the rectory. Now again, certainty is, quote, the firm conviction that something is the case, end quote. And doubt and certainty are just feelings, not fact. It's kind of like tunnel vision. You form your opinions based on what you know, but that may not be the full scope. Sister James' doubt, coupled with her certainty that she smelled alcohol, fuels Sister Aloysius' certainty that Father Flynn is no good and is taking advantage of Donald. And after Father Flynn is accosted by Sister Aloysius' suspicions, he adamantly denies them and tells Sister Aloysius that, quote, there are many things beyond your knowledge. Even if you feel certainty, it is an emotion, not a fact, end quote. And in this film, there is no absolute truth or justice for anyone, because in the very last scene, we see that Sister Aloysius tells Sister James that she has doubts and begins to break down in tears before the credits roll, which I do appreciate because it lets the audience form their own conclusion and opinions. But that specific scene at the end of the film really illustrated how conflicted Sister Aloysius felt in the end, because even after she quote unquote got what she wanted by Father Flynn agreeing to go to another parish, it was specified that Father Flynn was at 3 different parishes within the past 5 years, which is very odd, but it was never explained why. But her lying about her speaking to a nun at the different parishes and that resulting in him leaving and getting a promotion at his new parish, it shows how broken the system really is that Sister Aloysius once had so much faith in. And you can see that she really is having a crisis of faith. And I will honestly say that that is really what the movie is about, because she did take a step away from God to address what she believes to be wrongdoing. And the church and the institution that she has dedicated her life to has rewarded him in spite of the fact that he may potentially be a child abuser. And so by the end of the film, both Sister James and Sister Aloysius' worlds are turned upside down, and they're in a way bound to an institution that perpetuates the cycle of abuse, which is really sad. Was taking a step away from God even worth it? I don't know, because all Sister Aloysius is really left with by the end of it is doubt. Nothing is confirmed. And so now I guess the big question is if I believe that Father Flynn is guilty. And I don't know. I really don't know, because every time I watch the film, I change my mind. But I'm leaning more towards yes. What do you think? So yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. I'm so grateful for you guys. And I saw that I think I have like 300 and something subscribers. So thank you guys so much for being here. Yeah, be sure to check out my clothing brand, Main Character, the Label. By the time this video is up, or the week that this video is up, my new collection should be released. It's titled Gone Fishing, so check it out. And also I am releasing a new palette for my makeup brand, Box Office Beauty. It is a daytime horror theme. You know, a matter of fact, it's a daytime horror themed palette, so check it out, you know. But I don't want to, these are the shades. Okay, y'all see that in more detail in a different video. So yeah, I hope you guys feel safe in the scene wherever you are, and I hope you guys are finding joy and fulfillment on your journey of self-expression. Until next time.